Okay, welcome everybody to this Nuts developers meeting. It's the first Nuts tech session in a series of at least 4 sessions, but probably more. And this first session is about the DoD web method, SQL storage, and how to use these in relation to your customer relation management system. Something about the tech sessions. We try to keep them short, so we scheduled 4. Most of them are 2 weeks apart. They are mostly about knowledge sharing about the NUTS node and the technology it has on board. The sessions are set up that you can join in. So if you have Docker and a database and curl ready to go, you can join in with some commands on your own machine. Or if you are watching the video, you can pause and run commands yourself. I will provide theory and background information when needed. And so let's dive into this first session. The agenda for today, there are 3 subjects, like I told you. We'll start with the SQL part, then we'll move on to the web and the usage of these, connecting it to your own systems. So let's start with SQL first. So I'm not going to say something about how SQL databases work. It's just a big shift from what we did so far. So the NUTS node, until the current version, almost every piece of data is transported over the network. And all data that is transported over the network is part of a transaction. So all the data is signed when transported. This makes it, so we make heavy use of hashes and signatures, and this makes the use of key value storage a good choice. But when using, for example, DoD web, there are no transactions and there is no data to be shared across the network. So this is also a bit about the reasoning for using DoD web and not only DoD NUTS. So we discovered, although we wanted to, that the DoD NUTS will not be a global standard adopted by everyone. It's also pretty hard to resolve DoD documents from the DoD NUTS method on your mobile phone. We looked into installing a NUTS node on a mobile phone, but it's a bit hard. And with DoD web, all the DoD document related storage has now become relational because there are no longer transactions. DoD web also doesn't support any history for previous documents. There is just one state, which makes it also easier just to say, okay, add service, remove service, add some key material and remove some key material. Besides the DoD method, all the verifiable credentials and the way we use verifiable credentials will change as well. So this is something we learned, right? So we use authorization credentials, for example, until version 5 quite heavily to transport knowledge about the authorizations you have to access data at a certain point. If you look into how verifiable credentials are supposed to be used, and supposed to be is something we learned from what is everybody else doing in the world, then it's basically you have a wallet, and in that wallet are some assertions about you, not the things you can do, but the things that define you as a person or organization or whatever. And authorization credentials do not fit in this scheme. And based on these changes from DoD NUTS to DoD web, and also the changes for how we use credentials, the move to a SQL type database is pretty straightforward. and an easy choice to make. So some implementation use. What did we build already? There's support for SQLite, MySQL, and Postgres. So SQLite, of course, is supported, so we can also support a development image, and we can create some developer happiness. So if you start up your database, you don't have to start up your nuts node. You don't have to configure an external database. You can just start with a SQLite version, which is just stored somewhere on the file system. What we try to do is stay away from database specific type queries or constructs, for example, for JSON indexing. So we try to focus on SQL. The Nuts node will have database migrations built into it. So there's no need to run any database migration scripts at startup. We try to keep the configuration as simple as possible. So we just use a connection string. So when using an SQL database, you have to add something like you see on screen right now, a single configuration connection string. And this is the one for MySQL. So for Postgres and SQLite, they're quite different. But anybody who has used a SQL database, and especially MySQL in this case, will see that this is quite familiar, what you're seeing here. Okay, so this is an example on how to run the Nuts node just using a Docker command. I do have to say that apart from the highlighted connection string you see here, the current master branch still requires you to disable strict mode. That's a security reason, because if you do not make the choice to disable all kinds of security constructs, you have to have a config parameter. Also, because the next version will still have all the features which the current version has. In this example, I have to disable the network, or otherwise my installation will start to complain about not having configured any certificates. There is a commit that has been merged yesterday that will remove this nuts network enable TLS option. So that's no longer required. Something new as well, but I will return to this later, is the URL config parameter. And this is due to the fact that DID web requires a domain to be present. But I will discuss that with the DID web method. Okay, so if you start up the latest master version, you get a bunch of tables in your database. Currently, there are 14 tables in there, which store things like DIDs, services, verification methods, which is your public key material, but also things on credentials and revocations. So you also see a status list credential table in there that is used for revocations. I believe revocations is the next tech session in 2 weeks, where that will be addressed. Okay, that's it for the SQL database. Pretty straightforward. Of course, by using an off-the-shelf SQL database, you get backups and restores and cloud support out of the box. Also, running in a cluster is now more feasible than it was before, because all data storage will be moved to SQL database in the future, which only keeps the session storage, like in-memory storage, a question for being able to cluster your Nuts node. But more on that in the future. Okay, so we'll move on to the DoD web part. Why DoD web? Why not DoD Ion, which is a Microsoft thing? Why move away from DoD Nuts? There is quite a long list of DoD methods. I believe it's over 100 different methods long. So what is happening in the self-sovereign identity world is that a lot of parties are defining profiles. So there's a Dutch blockchain coalition profile, which is the DIIP short. Microsoft has a profile. There are some other profiles. And what you see is that almost all profiles say, okay, let's first support DoD Web and DoD JSON Web Key. And so there's something we all agree on. Especially if you look to mobile devices, if you want to support a DoD method out of the box, then probably HTTPS traffic is the only thing you support. DoD Web is also way easier than DoD Nuts, but that's why we defined DoD Nuts in the first place. Its security is also less than DoD Nuts. So for DoD Nuts, we took a lot of measures to make sure that it's impossible to change the DoD document or to hijack keys or to keep control over your keys even when they're stolen. For DoD Web, all these security measures don't work. So the question would be, is it still secure enough? Well, it's still on par with all the other things like using certificates or using JSON Web Key sets. And in the entire design for Nuts, we depend on multiple layers of security. So using a user-based wallet has to be used on top of, for example, a organization wallet alone. So multiple layers of security should counter any problems with the DoD Web method. Okay, so this is a bit of a background information. If you know how this works, then you know 90% of DoD Web. The DoD Web looks like you see the string on top. So DoD is always at the beginning, then you have the method, which in this case is web. Then you get a domain. So in this example, I chose nuts.local because that's the domain I use at my laptop. And after the domain, you can get a multi-tenant specific identifier. And you're allowed to use as much colons as you want to, because those will just be translated to slashes. So if you see a DoD Web that looks like this, you can translate it to an address where you can find a DoD document in file format, in the JSON file format. So the nuts local (im) weasel will be translated to nuts.local/im/weasel/did.json. That's where the DoD document lives for this DoD Web. It's easier to read. It's simple. It's multi-tenant capable, so any of your customers can get their own identity while still just using a single domain. It's also possible to omit the IAM weasel part and to use the root of your domain as a DoD Web, which, for example, would be the case for an issuer we all trust. Let's say the UZI register is going to issue credentials, then it will probably be a, let's say, uzi.cibg.nl domain, and that's it. No multi-tenant identifier, which is way easier to recognize. Also because the way we're going to manage trust changes. A lot of it will be done in configuration files, which we all agree on. And then it's way easier to just read a single domain than it is to read a domain with an extremely big UID or base 64 encoded hash somewhere in the identifier. So this is the most you need to know about DoD Web. This is like 90% of everything. Okay, so the requirements to use it within your Nuts node, master version or later version 6. You need a public accessible HTTPS endpoint. DoD Web only works on HTTPS. This is also something we identified. How are we going to support developer happiness if you can start a Nuts node out of the box and you need HTTPS to be able to use it? So we thought of a solution, and hopefully we can implement it in the next couple of weeks. No client certificates. So this is also a pretty big change. What we're currently thinking about, it's not final in all of its forms, is that node-to-node communication will probably not need client certificates anymore, which also means you can just use public available service certificates like the ones from Let's Encrypt or any other provider. At the use case level, we'll probably still recommend using PKI overhead certificates or UZI service certificates for the fire traffic, also using them as client certificates. But in the node-to-node communication, there will probably be no more client certificates needed. It's not final yet, but all signs point to not using client certificates anymore. Configuration, as of now, you have to add a single configuration called URL to your Nuts configuration file or using environment variables, which defines the publicly available address. There has been a feature request for using the host header or the X forwarded host header to dynamically define the domain. So if you want to create a DoD web, you might be able to use multiple domains on a single Nuts node. But we're still reviewing that feature request. Okay, so the new DoD method also means we're going to, or we added a version 2 API for the VDR. You can see it here that it says /internal/VDR/version 2 for creating and managing your DoD documents. The reason behind this is because DoD Web is also stored in the SQL database, that it's much more easier to do CRUD operations on it. When creating a new DoD, previously you could only say, okay, create this DoD for me, and then you would get the identifier back. With DoD Web, it's now possible to set your own identifier, which means that you can use a logical identifier or UID from your own system as the ID part for the DoD Web. I created 2 DoDs in my database, so to be some kind of more interactive and see that things happen. I'll show you the contents of my DoD table. As you can see, I created 2 DoDs, one with an empty post message, which gives me a UID. So the one created is DoD Web, that's local IAM, and then a UID, which is still possible. And in the second row, there is a DoD I created myself. So I gave the identifier I am Weasel. Okay. The resulting document is also much simpler than a DoD Nuts document, because with DoD Web, we actually only need a single type of key. You can see here that we added authentication, assertion method, key agreement, capability invocation, capability delegation. But actually the only key we use, key type, is the assertion method, which is used for signing. The DoD Nuts version has several key types in use, because one is used for changing the DoD document, which is done in a transaction. The other one is used in getting the access token, and another one is used for encrypting private transactions. But because DoD Web doesn't use transactions, we only need one type of key currently. There might be future use cases where we use multiple keys. If you look at this DoD document, there's also no controller field, where DoD Nuts had controllers, so which document could change another document. DoD Web doesn't have that. If you control the location where the file lives, then you control that DoD. Adding a service has become much, much easier. It's just a CRUD operation where you pass in the service data as a JSON object. So there's no need in updating the entire DoD document like we used to do with DoD Nuts. No, we can just say add service. We can also say add verification method, and then it's done. So if you look at the database, I added a single service, which has identifier 1 for this DoD, and the data just shows you a bit of JSON. And in this case, I added a service with a FHIR endpoint and a authorization endpoint. If you would look at the resulting DoD document, I omitted all the keys. You would see that the service has been added, and the exact same contents has been added as is in the database. So the DoD web, DoD documents are a result of the data that lives in the database, in a relational database, where previously with DoD Nuts, the DoD document was the prime format for the DoD document. The currently available APIs for DoD Web, there is a create, read, delete, and list API for DoDs. There's a create, update, and delete API for services, and there's a create and delete API for authentication method. As you can see, there's no read APIs on service and authentication method, because you should just use the read method on DoD. Actually, I think this is almost outdated, because Ryan implemented a read on the service today or yesterday. But it should all be in the OpenAPI specs and on the documentation side. Okay, so bringing these two together, so the DoD web part and SQL database, how are you going to manage the DoDs for your customers? So keeping track of the IDs. So I mentioned this earlier, and it's an important part, because the identifier part of the DID is no longer hash-based. You can set your own identifiers, which could mean that you do not have to store the entire DID in your own database, but you can just say, okay, I created a DID based on my own functional identifier, and used it together with the domain you specified. I can auto-generate it for all my customers. You should be aware that those identifiers will be publicly visible. So if you're thinking about exposing like sensitive information where others can see how many customers you have, or it's like primary key based, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I don't know if that's the most wise decision to publicly expose, but if you're already using UIDs, for example, for your customers, you can just reuse them. Keeping track of the DIDs and also the services that have been entered added to the DID is much easier because there's just CRUD APIs on it. What you do have to be careful about is the domain you have chosen. If it's a single domain, you probably also have to add it to your CRM. If you're using multiple domains, you also have to add that to all of your customer records. It might be the case that you all have already done it. Registering services. The base method of service registration is just create, update, delete. The NUTS node has no knowledge of the type of endpoint, right? So at a functional level, we previously defined, okay, there's like the concrete endpoint, which is a URL, and we have this compound endpoint, which is a object JSON, which can list multiple key value pairs if you need multiple endpoints for your service. We also heavily use the referenced services, right? So previously we said, okay, there will be like a vendor DID where you can register your different types of endpoints, like your production endpoint for all of your customers if you have a multi-tenant environment. We're not sure if this is going to survive, that you reference other services, because there is no more like vendor and care organization DID. That distinction is not relevant. So the advice will be to have your own CRM manage the common endpoints. So make some place somewhere in the database where you say, okay, this is my production endpoint, this is my staging endpoint, this is early adopters, this is for fire, this is for authorization, and use the CRUD APIs to just check if everything is up to date and everything has been added correctly. Okay, last slide. So the vendor care organization distinctions, just what I said. It's something that was not managed at the technical level, but it's the language used in most of the documentation and workshops. Previously in DAD NUTS, there was some kind of hierarchy because this controller part could say, okay, if you have like a care organization DAD document, it's controlled by the vendor DAD document and the keys that live there. That's not a technical distinction we can make anymore. So you have to look at it like you will probably have like a vendor DAD, which you might use for issuing credentials, but it lives next to the care organization DADs. So if you look at the NUTS node, what the NUTS node will do is make sure you can register your DIDs and the DID documents. You can load credentials, you can issue credentials, you can verify credentials, you can use the presentation exchange specifications, and the NUTS node will support the OpenID for VC type of specifications. It will mention care organizations and vendors less and less in the documentation. All of that will be moved to the wiki, which will say, okay, how are you going to use this piece of software for your use case? In your own CRM, you probably still want to make the distinction between the vendor DID and the care organization DID. Right? So if there's a reason to issue credentials from your vendor DID, then you need to know which DID this is. For example, the organization credential is still issued by the vendor DID. We would love the CMG to issue credentials on the organization level, because then you wouldn't need your vendor DD for that part.